Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming out on this beautiful Monterey afternoon. And I'm Dennis Colton, Museums and Archives Manager, along with Library Director Inga Waite. Both of us welcome you to the Monterey Public Library and to its continuing history programs for 2018. We're in for a special treat this afternoon, a 3-in-1 program. We usually only have one presenter. This time we have three presenters, and they are the three winners of the Monterey History Slam. And they will be presenting their award-winning history talks this afternoon. The History Slam was originally held at the Japanese American Citizen League Hall and over on Adams Street. Today's special event is presented by the Monterey Public Library in partnership with the National Steinbeck Center. We're also filming today, as you noticed, and thank you, Eric Palmer. Before we begin, let me introduce my colleague, historian Tim Thomas, who is our Master of Ceremonies for today, and who originated this first Monterey History Slam. So Tim, take it away.
So I should explain how this all kind of came about. So I, for many years, was the historian curator of the old Monterey Maritime Museum. And part of my duties when I worked for the Maritime Museum, I had to go and speak to service clubs. Rotary Club, Lions Clubs, Kiwanis Clubs. I think I've spoken to every Rotary Club between here and San Francisco that exists. There are breakfast ones, lunch ones, dinner ones. Monterey one actually has a cocktail one. I like that. But they often asked me to come back several times to do these things, and they had to give a talk for like 15 minutes, and so I had to come up with all these different talks. So I had this idea of why can't we have like a sort of festival of little 15-minute talks about the history of Monterey. And they didn't have to connect to anything other than they had to be the history of Monterey County. That was the idea. And my original idea was it would start at 8 o'clock in the morning and go till 5 o'clock at night, bang, 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 bang. And maybe we'll get there someday, but right now it started out with, Dennis mentioned we had 11 or 12 initially, and who were willing to go in and try it. And we found it was actually a lot of fun, so I was really happy the way it all turned out. So we're hoping to make this an annual event. Maybe, and I've been just today, we talked with maybe the library will help with this next year, and maybe we'll have it hold it here next year. So you can let us know. So the idea how this works, each speaker had 15 minutes, but because these three were the winners of the original one, and they asked me, what I told them, they wanted an extra 5 minutes, and I thought about it, and I said, well, the original idea was it was supposed to be 15 minutes. So I sort of compromised. I said, all right, you guys can give your first 15 minutes, then you can add the extra 5 minutes. So you get the 20 minutes, and then after the third presentation, we will have questions for the audience. Okay, so we'll start with the first, which is Louis Raines, right?
Exactly.
Who I met Louis when he worked at the Monterey Aquarium. I used to work at the aquarium many years ago as well. And Louis has put together, I think, a very interesting talk about good old Newt Hovden, who somebody I researched for many years as well. So I will turn to Louis, and thank you.
So to summarize, as we're getting ourselves started, this is the story of one of Cannery Row's most influential figures and most unsung, in my opinion. Just about everything we hear about Newt Hovden is he ran the largest cannery on Cannery Row. And that has pretty much summarized everything we've known up until just lately. For some reason, no one had really followed his story before. And we mentioned the aquarium. I recently retired from the aquarium, had 7 fantastic years there. And during that time, I realized that their #1 exhibit, as you walk in the door, second largest exhibit in the entire place, is the boiler exhibit. That is the boilers from the Hovden Cannery that used to stand on the site. But nobody really knew more than a few sentences about it. So I started digging. To understand Mr. Hovden, it is best to understand the world that he was walking into. And really the life of Hovden is the life of Cannery Row. He arrived about the time we were getting started. He really left right when the leaving was good, right about 1950. But he came from Norway. And Norway, and that whole northern Atlantic region, they've been fishing for thousands of years on the record. They really have mastered it. And here in Monterey, we had a very young industry back at the turn of the century. But if you were a Norse fisherman right around 1903, you might have read in the regular publications that a certain Knut Hovden was awarded a scholarship, 1903, for the warm and cold preservation of fish. Food preservation, honestly, it was just getting started. France and Norway were among the first places to even try to preserve fish, especially for very long. Of all the things you can preserve, fish tends to turn very, very quickly. So they were working on different ways that we could have the food to travel. And that was a brand new concept for that time. Other than that, the only traveling foods we really had at that time were dried meats, jerkies, things like that. So here we are, Monterey, about the same time, 1903, 1904. Not much of a fishing industry here. It's just getting started. Colton, of course, hasn't changed much at all, although they do have a new lawn mowing system that's upgraded from the old one. And Monterey at that time, of course, had a lot of other action that I find really, really colorful, and I wish I had time to explore it all. H.R. Robins started the first cannery here, arguably. There were two or three that people argue were the first, but Robins had one of the very first. It didn't make quite enough money to keep ends meeting, so he added a dance hall. And these are tokens, or the front and back side of a token that you could have gotten for H.R. Robins Dance Hall, good for one glass of beer. Well, you gotta support the industry some way. California's first theater, of course, way back when, looking really just not that different. Everything around it changed a lot. Alvarado Street, remarkably the same, we might note, but definitely just getting out of the horse and buggy days and using little tiny boats. Now, eventually, I would love to do another full hour on the kinds of ships and nets that we used over the years, because it's beautiful detail. But we were using little felucca boats. This is more or less designed based on the Sicilian fishing boat. And if you notice, both ends are pointed so it can go forwards and backwards. It's a real efficient little boat. They were using, I believe, the early Lampara net, the lightning net. And, of course, at this time, there was still a Chinese fishing village right beside where Mr. Hovden was going to end up with his cannery. The fishing village, of course, went down right about 1906, shortly after Hovden got here, and that property was his within a decade. Again, another story worth exploring is that 1906 fire. But let's jump over to Norway, because back in Norway, Knut Hovden's at Ålesund, Norway, one of those fishing towns, and he's working in the smokehouse, the manager of the smokehouse for a preserving company there. Beautiful town, about 1,100 people. Well, one particular night when, well, let's just say the events are in question exactly what happened, Ålesund burnt to the ground, took down 850 of the city's 1,100 homes. I hear there was only one actual fatality, a lady who went back to get her purse. But the destruction was well known, spread around the world. According to all of the testimony, and they interviewed dozens of witnesses, the fire started in the smokehouse. Actually, all of the testimonies except for one, Knut Hovden was the sixth witness, and he declared it was absolutely impossible that it could have started in the smokehouse. But everyone else was pretty much in agreement. There are even rumors that it was something to do with insurance fraud, and the fire may have been intentional, but that's still being investigated by people to these days, and most certainly alcohol was involved, although centrally or peripherally, we don't know exactly. So Knut Hovden gives his testimony on March 19th. Coincidentally, later on, he would claim to have left the country on March 18th. But this is the manifest that brought him to America. 1904, he arrives in New York. He spends 1904 running around the country trying to make connections, basically. He ran into one fellow, a fellow named Booth, who was well known in the canning industry. Not our Frank Booth, but another Booth, who was in Chicago at the time. But that Booth's nephew, Frank Booth, was already getting started here on the bay. And he had the first really large-scale successful cannery that continued operating even later. He'd come as a salmon packer, and in the early days, honestly, it was hard to get people interested in sardines, because sardines are kind of different from the big fish that we were used to, and almost always large chunks of fish sell better than little tiny bony ones. But nonetheless, it was time to get the world interested in sardines. That needed technology. So all the technology that was booming about this time was dollars that day. Every time you could come up with a better idea, things moved quickly. There were more sardines than anybody could ever process, so how can we process them faster? One of Hovden's early inventions was the fish beheading machine. And there are several different versions of this machine that happened over the years, but essentially they had to find a way to get the head and the tail cut off. Normally there was a third blade that would come along, split it down the underside so that you could get the guts out as well. And that's the world that Hovden was walking into. Just exploding with technology, exploding with potential, and exploding with the idea of an aquarium. And I'll come back to this lately, but up until the Monterey Bay Aquarium, I think there was only one previous aquarium in town, I've heard, and it was down on Fisherman's Wharf. Dr. Steve Webster from the aquarium described it as actually just a room with a lonely sea lion in it. So we have upgraded that kind of attraction for sure. But over the years, there were several times that people tried to get an aquarium here, and Newt was one of the big proponents of that. So, 1916, Newt separates from Frank Booth, goes and starts his own cannery right at the place where the Monterey Bay Aquarium is now. He is very, very popular in that he has already gone to several World's Fairs and introduced sardines successfully. Again, this was a tough pitch. No one was really into sardines at first, and tuna, salmon, have always dominated the canning industry, but they were able to build up a little bit of interest by getting the Grand Prix at several World Fairs. About this time, of course, Newt had to register for the World War I draft. And note, he lists his address at 425 Ocean View. That is the old Tevis place. Apparently, he was living in one of the front shacks of the Tevis mansion at the time. And being an entrepreneur of real power, he's also trying to set up other businesses at the same time. We think of the Hovden Cannery as just being one place. Hovden had places all up and down the West Coast. This is a picture of the establishment of the San Diego Cannery, which ran the longest. It was run by his brother, who emigrated shortly after he did. But those were the two largest canneries. He also had several others, a sauce plant in Dakota, a couple of them up the coast, and even tried to work out of Oregon and Washington for a while. But then, one more fire visits Newt Hovden. And this was just a few years after he had opened, 1916. Well, 1921, whole place gets burnt to the ground. He suspected arson, but no one really knows for sure. And in those days, a lot of canneries burned under mysterious circumstances, smaller fires, not the insurance scams that were later to hit the abandoned canneries, but the competition of just taking out the guy next door. But once again, we find Newt suggesting an aquarium, this time not in Monterey, but in PG, suggesting that the availability of clean, clear salt water sure would make an aquarium convenient. And that does stand to reason, because today the Monterey Bay Aquarium cycles through, 1,800 gallons of salt water every minute, which comes in directly from the bay, and it's that fresh salt water that really gives them the ace to be able to display the animals that they can. So with more expansion, Newt opens his business offices in San Francisco. He has a reduction factory in Oregon. He has several others up and down the coast. Sardines are finally becoming popular. People are starting to like them, and that's largely because with World War I, the Army needed a whole bunch of food that could be transported. Well, sardines fit that bill just perfectly, and each time we had a world war, it really was good for the Monterey economy. And so worldwide, they started to catch on. The other companies have, of course, jumped up about this time. You've got so many other packing companies here in town. I think we maxed out at somewhere around 20 canneries and reduction plants on Cannery Row, depending on exactly which period and which way you're defining your buildings. But long story short, the industry had finally caught. And so Newt bought the property, which had previously belonged to the University of California, Berkeley, and before that had gone through several changes of hand, I believe, with the Pacific Improvement Company. But long story short, ends up being traded off shortly after that tragic fire at China Point. A few years later, goes back to the University of California, Berkeley, and then gets sold to K. Hovden Company. Hovden starts really pushing the sardine. He puts out this excellent book of recipes All kinds of different things you can do. There is a sardine jello recipe you might want to try one of these days. Oh, yeah. Imagination. And the boats, of course, at this time were having to get a little bit larger. We moved to what we call the Monterey Clipper. You'll see many, many pictures of these boats. The types of nets were changing rapidly as well. And then come the rough times. This is going to happen to any big businessman. But every now and then, Newt was discovered, pretty regularly actually, reducing more sardines than he was canning. Now, you can sardines, it's very labor intensive. You've got to get so many sardines into each can. It's very complicated, takes a lot of steps. But if you can just take the whole batch of sardines, cook them down into fish meal, stick it in bags and sell it, it's the best agricultural feed and fertilizer, and low labor, high profit. Lots of places wanted to reduce more than they were allowed to, and Colton was definitely caught doing that several times. They actually shut down his second cannery. He had his main cannery and then another one on the street. They actually ordered his second one shut down for a year. Same thing happened to other canning companies as well. Everybody seemed to be trying to reduce more fish than they were canning. So they shut his other place down for a year, while at that time the unions were starting to need more attention. There was a non-stop battle between the fishermen and the cannery owners, waged about 40 years. Always the cannery owners were trying to get the best deal, and always the fishermen were trying to get more money. This led to strikes, this led to all kinds of mysterious circumstances where there were small fires, things like that, and a lot of just plain old PR information. The odor was a big issue. Reducing sardines, you can imagine taking just a bunch of heads, tails, guts, and everything, just cooking it down. It is aromatic, to say the least. And what is that phrase that everyone around here knows so well? Carmel by the sea, Pacific Grove by God, Monterey by the smell. And it really was very true for a long time. The lawsuits that went back and forth between the Del Monte Hotel and the cannery commissions and the canning organizations, back and forth for years, never really resolved until the industry naturally took care of itself, right around the late 40s, when, of course, the sardine catch suddenly plummeted. Oh, this is referring to the place being shut down, the fish at the World's Fair. This is yet again referring to the extreme amount of advertising and publicity it took to get the world's even into sardines a little bit. And it was, we still find some sardines around now, but it's not nearly the way it was. My grandparents used to love them. They loved the mustard flavor best. Traditionally, I think Colton had spiced olive oil, a tomato sauce, and a mustard sauce, and those were his three big leading products. But again, that's not a perfect system. One by one, these little things kept popping up, little violations. Any big business is going to have this, but after a while, they become expensive. And this is at the same time Newt is trying to expand. He got himself his cannery up at Moss Landing that actually had to start by canning some basking sharks, which is another story that would take a little while. But nonetheless, yes, we had a little shark industry here for quite some while. And he continues to expand up and down the coast. Now, one of the more interesting cases of how to deal with the law that Newt had was, apparently, it looks like, from what I can put together, a whole bunch of the cannery owners here got together, put a bunch of money in a pool, and gave it to a senator. Okay, that makes perfect sense to me, except that somebody noticed, and consequently, it was Senator Hornblower. An appropriate name, eh? But nonetheless, this is the long list of companies that all contributed to the massive bribe that eventually did get discovered. And if you've discovered one, I doubt that one's floating alone by itself in space. That means there are probably a whole lot more that were never discovered. Now, things are going so well at this point that Kay Hovden has an idea. We can get more fish out of the water. What if we just lower an electrical device down into the ocean, zap the fish with an electric charge, and then use a big vacuum scoop to pump them right out? That'll save us the trouble of using those old-fashioned nets. Yeah, good idea. That one, thankfully, didn't ever materialize, but it does represent just how ambitious he was and just how willing he was to embrace new technologies. The concept of electrically shocking fish to catch them was very popular there for a little while in the 40s and 50s. Not so much today. And one of my favorite cases kind of gives you an idea how you have to be to run a big business. This is Hovden versus Carl Reitz. Reitz had sold to the Mazama Company, and that is one of Hovden's other companies up in the Northwest, had sold to the Mazama Company 4 big industrial compressors, big presses, kind of squeezed down for the reduction process. Well, they weren't ready quite on time, so Hovden says, okay, fine, you just give me the other 2 when they're ready. I'll take 2 from my Hovden plant, I'll move them up here to the Northwest, it's fine. Long story short, Hovden makes 1 payment, and the Mazama Corporation goes out of business. Well, Carl Reitz is not very happy about this because he just watched a little sleight of hand where all of his reduction machines got put into Hovden's hands, but officially they were sold to the Mazama Corporation. So he was unable to recover anything from that because Hovden had quite simply shut down the business that was responsible for those presses and moved the presses into his own place. To add insult to injury, a few years later, Carl Reitz and Hovden have businesses side by side in Sausalito. And I'm pretty sure there was a day where Carl Reitz looked over and saw his equipment sitting next door, the stuff that he had not ever been paid for, and at that point, years later, he tried to go back and file another suit. It didn't take. And quite honestly, the Mazama, which was parked for a little while there in Sausalito, sank there and is still down there somewhere, they say. So World War II comes along, and here we have Newt registering for World War II, registering for the draft. And by this time, you're talking about a guy who's, let me think, yes, he's pushing 50. He's been running this business forever. And he's finally getting a little tired. About the same time, of course, we've watched the sardine industry peak and begin going downhill. Late 40s were not nearly as friendly to everyone else. And Kay had his own idea. I should pause parenthetically. I keep calling him Kay Hovden. The truth is he hated the name Newt. Did not like the name Newt at all. It was given to him by a Danish midwife when he was a little child, when he was freshly born. And he didn't like the name because he thought it was Danish. She only gave the kid a name because they didn't think he would live, because he was a sickly infant. But then he did live, continued to thrive, and just despised the name Newt till the day he died. So called himself Kay, which is the reason I eventually ended up doing that. But Hovden, about this time, had an idea that it must be somebody's fault the sardines are disappearing. And so we looked around for whose it might be. Coincidentally, we had war activity going on out in the bay at the time. So he was pretty certain that the Army's dumping of munitions, and specifically dumping chemicals like arsenic, had affected the plankton, and that was the food for the sardines. And so the Army could take ultimate responsibility for our sardine collapse. Now, of course, we understand a little bit better that sardines are really regulated by the temperature cycles that go up and down about every 60 years or so. And this semi-extinction was sort of scheduled. It's just that we were fishing the sardines so fast it looked like an immediate drop-off. But one way or the other, late 40s, early 50s, we were going to have less sardines than before. So we began trucking them in. Sardines were trucked from far away, they were trucked from San Diego, they were trucked from up north. There were a lot more sardines, for instance, at that time in the waters that were just north of San Francisco Bay. So they were coming in from everywhere to be canned here, but that's a lot of expense. And it just plain didn't work very long. PG, Pacific Grove, was also getting after Newt because the Monterey Bay Aquarium property, which is the Hovden Cannery property, sits on the border between Monterey and Pacific Grove. While Newt was very, very good at following Monterey's laws about reduction, he realized he could take a step over this way and simply turn his reduction to the other side of the building and wouldn't be governed by Monterey's rules about reduction. And, of course, Pacific Grove eventually noticed that and said, no, you can't just move to the other side of the building and get away with that. But again, we're talking about a guy who's getting tired. He's been doing this forever. None of it was ever easy. And this is a story that I've learned from Tim. Thank you, sir. He's going to get out of town. He's trying to sell the business. It turns out he owes money around town. The IRS is definitely after him. And so he finds some guys who are willing to buy his business for cash, $100,000. He can't get a check because if he gets a check, it'll go to the bank, it'll be official, it'll be on the record, the IRS will find him. So a cash transaction is much more discreet. He takes this $100,000 that they give him, and according to this reliable source, goes into the cannery one evening, takes that money, puts it all into sardine cans, sticks the case in his trunk, and heads straight for Mexico. Now, he had many times before taken samples down south through San Diego, visited his brother, taken samples to Ensenada, things like that. It's just that this time he didn't bother coming back. So, 1951, he's out of town. His managers and secondaries took over the business, and they ran it, of course, for a couple more decades. It was the last cannery to survive on Cannery Row, eventually shut down in 1973. But Cannery Row itself had undergone some major changes, as had our fishing industry, which was in its wane, now inviting the tourism industry that's made us so popular today. And 10 years later, in Guadalajara, Knut Hovden dies of a heart attack. No one knows exactly what he was doing within that 10 years. There were all kinds of rumors. There were rumors that he could have been running a whole canning industry from south of the border. It's reasonable that he was probably staying in touch with his brother in San Diego. There are even rumors that he went to South America and continued his entrepreneurship down there. Nobody's really sure. But he did get returned in spirit and remains, anyway, to Carmelo Cemetery, not far from here. And the cannery sat there for another, it closed down in 73, sat there for a good 5-7 years before eventually the Packard family became interested and turned it into the Monterey Bay Aquarium that it is today. The only thing that they were able to save from the original structure was the boiler house. Now, it was built to last. Quite honestly, Kay was one of those people who understood the basic dynamics. A boiler can blow up, and it happens. We don't like to talk about it, but it happens sometimes. If it's going to happen, it'd be nice if it didn't take out the rest of the whole block. So the boiler house was built to extreme sturdy specifications and has survived all the way to this very day. I think it went up in 1940, if I'm not mistaken. And today you can still go see the boiler house. That's the framework that's around that. There are 3 boilers there now. And again, this is where I got started, just being around the front of the aquarium, looking at these machines. One of them has the date 1913. One of them says it's from another institution, a mental institution up in Palo Alto, has the name of the institution on it. Very confusing. So that's why I started trying to track them down. The individual boilers came from assorted places. But we still have that whole front area to remind us about what the place used to be. And I have to respect the aquarium for doing that thing. For years and years, that building was dedicated to taking fish out of the water and selling them. Now, the whole building is sort of devoted to keeping as many fish in the water as possible. Maybe not eating every single one of them. So that's the story of Knut Hovden, K. Hovden, the King of Cannery Row. Thank you.
The story of Mr. Hovden, and he left, took off for Mexico. So from time to time, I give walking tours of Cannery Row. And as Lewis mentioned, one of those rumors that Hovden took off for South America. And I had a couple on my tour one day who were from Peru. Peru in the 40s and 50s actually had a fairly large sardine fishery down there. And I told this couple that story, Mr. Hovden packing up that money in the sardine cans, gave the can, both the car, driving off to Mexico. And the young man looks at me and he says, you know, when I was a boy, my grandfather used to tell the story of this Norwegian who shows up in Peru with all this money. All right, so our next speaker, Jeff Rothel, actually going to speak about another sort of unforgotten man in Monterey, a guy named Harry Greene. All right.
All right, so as Tim mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Harry Greene today. Some of you may have heard his name before. For those of you who haven't, you'll hopefully learn a thing or two. Harry Greene was important to Monterey history for a couple of different reasons. One of the reasons that I'm going to talk about him today is that he helped to preserve a lot of Monterey's natural and cultural history. The other thing I'm going to talk about is the way he brought Monterey into the 21st or 20th century, I should say. So Harry was born in San Francisco in 1852 to fairly well-to-do parents. As you can see from the house he was born in, it was more of a mansion than a house. It later became a hospital, an orphanage, and a school. So even though his older brother a couple years earlier was born in a 2-room house, by the time he was born, it was much fancier accommodations. Harry's early years were very active. From what I can tell, he was interested in sports. He was baseball player. He was a well-known roller skater in San Francisco, and he was a very avid bicyclist. The other thing that was important about his early years is at the mansion where he grew up, his parents hosted a boarder named Thomas Bridges, who was a famous botanist. And Bridges instilled in Harry a love of plants and trees, which will play a major role throughout his lifetime. As I mentioned, skating and cycling were very big parts of Harry's early life. He led a group called the San Francisco Bicycle Club. This is a photo of them traveling through the East Bay on their penny farthings. I'm not sure which one Harry is, but you can actually buy this as a poster from Amazon.com, which of course I had to do. In addition to the interests I mentioned earlier, throughout his lifetime, Harry had a wide variety of occupations. I went through all the census records, and he listed himself variously as a stockbroker, as a real estate agent, as a nurseryman. He was constantly going from one thing to another, had a lot of time on his hands. For much of his early adult life, he ran a stock brokerage with his brother Clay, and that was in San Francisco. And Harry eventually became vice president of the Pacific Stock Exchange. He did a little bit of dabbling in mining in Placer County, and did some traveling to Europe where he obtained some of his schooling. And he, like most of you, was interested in history, and so he spent some time in cemeteries and missions and places like that throughout the state of California. So how did he get to Monterey? From what I can tell, he first came to Monterey around 1871. Monterey was sort of in decline at that time. It wasn't quite as nice a place it was during the time when it was the capital of California. A lot of things were starting to fall apart. So, as I mentioned, things were kind of falling apart. Here's an account from Charles Warren Stoddard, the author, talking about the custom house and how it had a squatter living in there, it had a goat hanging out there. So we weren't taking real good care of our cultural resources at the time that Greene first came to Monterey. Reasons why he came to Monterey, I think the primary one was that he married a young lady named Belle Little, who was the daughter of one of Monterey's major landowners. Her father, Milton Little, owned much of what is now New Monterey. So not only did Harry start out wealthy, but he married into wealth. Also, his brother quit the stock business, went on to become a famous playwright. And Harry also had to retire because of medical reasons. So in his 30s, he, quote, retired, but he would go on to do a lot more after that. Other reasons why I think he wanted to move here, he thought he could make a big difference in Monterey as far as helping improve the city, and he thought he could make a lot of money as well. I'm not saying he did it for entirely altruistic purposes, but he was very much an idealist, and he thought he could preserve our cultural landmarks, our natural history, as well as turning Monterey into a major port to even rival cities like San Francisco. So if you're in Monterey right now and you drive through the tunnel toward Pacific Grove, on the left-hand side you'll see the mansion that Harry built. It was completed in 1887, and as you can see here, this is an early photo of it. Today it looks pretty much the same. They've done a good job of restoring the exterior. The interior still needs quite a bit of work. Something else that you'll notice over here is the carriage house that he built, which stands on Hawthorne Avenue, a couple hundred yards away from the mansion. Obviously, when he first moved here in the 1880s, they didn't have cars, and so the carriage house was used for horse-related business. And those of you who have been here for more than 30 years or so probably remember Consuelo's Mexican restaurant, which existed in the building back in the 1980s and I think early 90s. It's gone through a number of different iterations. The house has been an antique store. It was a French restaurant at one point, and who knows, it was just sold around June 18th, and I'm not sure who bought it, but it's zoned as a business, so you can't have residents living in there. So we'll see who moved in there soon enough, I think. Since Greene was a wealthy landowner, he not only owned the property that the mansion sat on, but he owned the entire block. And so he pretty much had everything from Drake Avenue down to Dickman and Lighthouse to Hawthorne. This was the mansion that we were just looking at. This was a house that he built, where his mother eventually moved in, and then the carriage house is over here. Much of the rest of the property was filled with gardens, and I'll be talking about those in just a minute. So as I mentioned, the house sold just a couple of weeks ago for $975,000, which in Monterey these days is probably something of a bargain. After he built it, remember it was completed in 1887, it was visited by all kinds of dignitaries, famous people like John Muir, the conservationist, Theodore Roosevelt, John McLaren, who started Golden Gate Park. So Harry had a lot of influence in his social circles. The mansion was also visited by some people who weren't quite so welcome. In 1894, a burglar or two showed up at his house, and in order to scare off the burglar, he picked up a chair and shook it and made a lot of racket, and the burglar proceeded to go next door to his neighbor's house. His neighbor was Colonel Jones, a friend and colleague, and the burglar robbed Colonel Jones instead of Harry Greene. Another unwanted visitor, perhaps, was a couple years earlier. Harry was doing some work on his yard and found a skeleton which probably belonged to a Native American. Native American remains are pretty common in that part of Monterey, so that wouldn't be a surprise. As I said earlier, Harry was into growing things. In the early 1890s, he started a tree nursery that eventually expanded into what was known as the Federation of Tree Growing Clubs of America, which had chapters all over the country. They had a magazine that came out regularly out of Chicago, and Harry developed a nickname of Tin Can Greene, and the reason for that was he advocated people starting trees in tin cans where the can would protect the sapling from predators and from the elements until it got big enough to survive on its own. And those cans that he used were often from the sardine canneries, connecting to our previous talk. How much did he love trees? He was constantly writing articles about tree planting and tree preservation. He would write technical reports, he would write scholarly journal articles, he would send these tree saplings all over the world. In some cases he would get payment for them, and other times he'd exchange them for other exotic trees, but it was a very expensive endeavor on his part, and after a couple decades or so he ran out of money to keep sending these trees all over the world. He was a very vocal advocate for preserving the cypress trees around the Monterey Peninsula. As most of you probably know, our cypress trees are a unique resource, and he wanted to turn Cypress Point into a national park, but that never happened. He was very involved in flower cultivation. He loved fuchsias, and to this day, if you go to the website of the American Fuchsia Society, you'll see Harry's name mentioned rather prominently. He even did articles for the Monterey Herald about the growing of fuchsias, and you can see that his drawings, well, maybe art wasn't his strong suit. He knew the parts of a flower. These are the members of one of his tree growing clubs. This was probably taken on the property over on Lighthouse Avenue. And he would travel around and talk to people about trees and advocate the growing of trees and planting of trees. And some people thought he went a little overboard with it, which may have been the case. This particular individual was at the University of California, Berkeley, and said that Harry talked for 3 hours on a topic that should have only taken 15 minutes. And Harry would go into all of the schools in the area and talk to the kids about growing and planting trees, try to instill in them the value of trees and how important they are. So they would write back to him and talk about how they were taking good care of the trees, and they would make sure that they would survive over summer vacation. And in some cases, the kids would talk about what they did after they planted the trees. Ernest Parmiano was more interested in eating cake, I think, than he was in planting trees, which is understandable for a second grader. These were some of the more scholarly journal and magazine articles that Greene wrote about tree planting and propagation. You can see that he delved into everything from redwoods to cypress to pines and a variety of other trees. His property there on Lighthouse, as I mentioned, was like a botanical garden. People would come from all over the world to see his gardens that he and his wife had. And not only did they have great trees and plants and landscaping, he had a pond on the property and a stream going through there, came down from the mountains, and the stream had trout in it, if you can imagine that, right near downtown Monterey. He even started a frog hatchery there at one point, an experiment that I don't think worked out too well. And he had a couple baby alligators at one point too. One of the things he did in the 1890s was he started an experimental opium farm, and I guess while he successfully grew opium, it was sort of cost prohibitive, so he didn't go into that business for very long. There aren't too many photos of Greene on the property in the gardens, but I found this one a while back of him and his wife Belle. At least I presume that's who it is, and you can see they have all their critters here, their dog and their bird and the cat down here. So he's obviously fond of animals. In fact, in 1907, he had a registered Boston Terrier who was registered with the American Kennel Club. In addition to domestic animals and plants, he was very much into wildlife, fish and wildlife. Here's a photo of him on a boat with the author Charles Warren Stoddard, who's on his left and or on our left. And it's obviously a salmon catching thing that they had going there. And if you notice in the background here, there are some of these big white ships. This was 1908 when the Great White Fleet from the US Navy was visiting Monterey. Greene was a member of the State Fish and Game Protective Association. He was Monterey's representative in this organization for a decade or two, and he was one of the first proponents of a marine reserve off the Monterey coast. He helped establish a squid reserve, you could say. He also was very involved in the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History. He was on their board of directors for quite some time, and he donated both financially as well as giving objects to the museum. Anybody recognize that scene?
Lake Elistero.
Right, so that's Lake Elistero here in downtown Monterey. He was also a strong advocate for turning that property into a city park, and shortly after his death, the city declared the island on Lake Elistero Harry Greene Island. The other thing he was very involved in was preserving, or one of the other things he was involved in was preserving local landmarks. And so, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our local landmarks, the adobes and such, were kind of disintegrating when he came to the area. And possibly what he's best known for is helping to preserve Colton Hall, the building where California's Constitution was signed. It was falling apart in the 1890s. The city was thinking of tearing it down. There were possibly some instances of vandalism, and so, at least according to one author and artist, Harry stood outside Colton Hall with a gun to help keep it from being vandalized, and said that he would shoot anybody who would do damage to the building. That might be a little fanciful, but there are at least one or two accounts that say that he took up arms to protect the building. He also helped to preserve and restore the Custom House. He was a member of lots of different local civic organizations, like the Native Sons of the Golden West, and they did a lot of work in the early 1900s to make sure that the Custom House was preserved and protected. And the same with the First Theater. It was Greene's idea, apparently, to turn the First Theater into a museum, and so even though it's not in great shape today, it may not be there if it wasn't for efforts of people like him. The other side of Harry Greene was Harry the Entrepreneur. He, as I mentioned, wanted to turn Monterey into a major port. He thought that if we became a major port, we could have a railroad connecting the Central Valley to Monterey and bring all kinds of agricultural goods in here so they could be shipped out all over the world. As Lewis mentioned earlier, Alvarado Street, while it looks similar to the way it did in the 19th century, in my opinion, it's changed quite a bit. This is what it looked like in the mid to late 1800s. This is what it looked like in 1907, starting to look a little bit sophisticated. And by 1927, it looked almost like a real downtown. Now, how did things change there? One of the things that happened is that Greene decided to build a hotel on Alvarado Street in 1904. A lot of people thought that was a folly, bad investment, but he decided to go with it anyway, and it was pretty successful. It still stands there today. Some of you probably recognize it. And if you look up at the top of the building, it's got his name right there. Now, the Monterey was one of the most luxurious hotels in the area. It's where people who either couldn't afford to stay at the Del Monte would stay, or if they didn't have room at the Del Monte, the Monterey was a good alternative. And obviously, it made front page news when it was first built. His friend Charles Warren Stoddard, before they became buddies, visited the Monterey, and Stoddard was kind of an old curmudgeon, and he was complaining that the $2.50 fee per night was a little too much. He wasn't too happy about that. But the Monterey included all of the luxuries that you would have expected in a modern hotel in 1904, including a cigar store run by Frank Hellam. And those of you who are familiar with downtown Monterey will know that Hellam's Tobacco Shop still exists on Alvarado Street. It's the longest continuously running business in Monterey. It's been there for 125 years now. And the Monterey included electric elevators, which were a big deal back then. And speaking of electricity, Greene was one of the people who brought electricity to Monterey. He was one of the executives with the electric company. And obviously electricity is a major thing when you want to become a modern city, because before we had electricity, this was mass transportation. But according to even national magazines, the electric streetcar that ran between Monterey and Pacific Grove was one of the things that brought the city into the 20th century. Greene also bought a property on Calle Principal, where a girls' school existed over near Calle Principal and Franklin. Looked something like this in the 1880s. Greene apparently bought it as a long-term investment because it wasn't really worth much as an empty piece of land, but by 1926, the San Carlos Hotel was built on that property. Those of you who have been in Monterey for a long time fondly remember the Hotel San Carlos, I think. I never got to see it, unfortunately, but they say it was quite a gathering place. And it's on the property that's now occupied by the Monterey Marriott across from the conference center. But when the San Carlos opened, it was a very big deal. Even more than the Monterey Hotel that I talked about earlier. It had every amenity you could imagine. In addition to building the Hotel Monterey, Greene was responsible for some other industries in Monterey. A lot of you probably are familiar with the Great Oil Fire of 1924, where a big oil tank near Cannery Road got hit by lightning. And Greene was one of the people responsible for bringing oil to Monterey. So even though he didn't fulfill his dreams of getting a railroad to Monterey and turning it into a great port, he did get the breakwater built finally in his later years. And just want to mention that a lot of people have helped me with my research, and I want to thank some of them here. So thank you for your attention.
This talk takes me back very early to the Chautauqua movement, Pacific Grove, which I did a book on. The Chautauqua movement, Pacific Grove, was established in 1880 at the Pacific Grove Retreat, which had been established in 1875, a Methodist camp retreat in Pacific Grove. And it was a mail order study course that you could participate on, and was directed toward advancing the education of the general public. Pacific Grove was also directed toward advancing the education of school teachers in Monterey County. Every 2 weeks during the summer, you could participate in a program that offered education in literature, emphasis on natural history. Arts were available for that education. So instructors would come from the University of California, California State Normal School, San Jose, Mills College, University of the Pacific, which was then located in San Jose, and later on when Stanford University was established in 1892, professors would come and participate in this program, educating primarily, it turns out, women and school teachers. So I'm thinking, school teachers, Monterey County. I'm sitting in Soledad at a Starbucks one morning, and I'm thinking, Mrs. Steinbeck was a school teacher in the 1880s, 1890s, during that period. Didn't she have any connection with this? And what was it like being a school teacher in Monterey County during that period of time? So I started thinking about Mrs. Steinbeck, and it turns out her older sister, Una, was a school teacher in Monterey County. And then I got all involved with the Hamilton family, right? Which is Olive's parents and siblings. There's Samuel and Eliza. They are part of East of Eden story. John Steinbeck explains a part of this family history in the book East of Eden. Here's the Hamilton clan, 50th anniversary, October 1899, at the Steinbeck home in Paso Robles, California. The Hamilton children, Lizzie, Tom, Desi, Mary, Una, Will, Olive, George, and Joseph are pictured in that 50th anniversary picture. That's John and Olive Steinbeck's home during their short time when they lived in Paso Robles. So, how do I start going about this whole story of finding this, right? Kind of very much like John Steinbeck did for East of Eden. He says about East of Eden, he says, I went through all the old Salinas, California newspapers. Wonderful things, those papers. Social notes, church notes, birth, deaths. No matter how much checking you do, somebody's going to squawk about a mistake and be right too, likely. I always make mistakes and I have to re-correct myself when I'm doing this research. Well, I have now available to me more than those newspapers, which he got on microfilm. I go through Google, and I search Google everywhere which way I can to find the history of what I'm looking for. So I start on my path, right? One of the stories that I find come out of this whole history of the Steinbeck family, the Hamiltons, is Samuel Hamilton. He's in November of 1885. He's relocated from San Jose to Salinas, and he's purchased a sizable piece of property at the corner of Main Street and Central Avenue from this famous Scotsman, David Jacks. We all know David Jacks, Jacks Peaks. Well, it turns out in 1888, which is just about the same time he's going to relocate to southern Monterey County, to the property which is going to be the location of the ranch for the story East of Eden. He sells the city of Salinas, has to purchase that property, or wants to purchase the property that Samuel Hamilton owns, to widen the intersection to a uniform width of 75 feet. So I'm like, Central and Maine, what's at Central and Maine and Salinas? Well, it turns out that's where the National Steinbeck Center is. So it's another little bit of history of connecting all the dots and telling the story of the Hamilton family. Here's the Hamilton Ranch, which he locates to in South Monterey County. The homestead records for Sam Hamilton states that he sold the land of August 3rd, 1887, filed a land claim on August 1887, and approved for homestead July 27th, 1891. Homestead Patent 1891. So this gives us a really clear idea of when when Hamilton moves from Salinas down onto the property in South Monterey County. It's Hamilton Canyon, just out of King City. Okay, and then I find this other piece of information in a newspaper article that I searched. It comes popping up about a dry artesian well. Sam Hamilton goes down there and tries to locate well on this piece of property, which he and 10 other family members homesteaded. Everybody got a homestead piece of property for the ranch. So you got, I think, 160 acres, allows you to put together a 1,600 acre ranch. Sam Hamilton went down and spent $3,000 in 1891, I believe it is, or 1899, trying to locate water on this well, on this property. He never hits water, right? Sizable amount of money poured into locating water on a ranch which he never found. Another little piece that we find. So then there's this other piece that I keep putting together, which Steinbeck gives me clues to. In his books, Travels with Charlie, In Search of America, he provides a small bit of information about Sam Hamilton's daughters, right? My grandfather, Samuel Hamilton, loved good writing and he knew it too. And he had some blue stocking daughters, among them my mother. Now I had mentioned Lizzie earlier and Una. Well, it turns out the oldest daughter, who immigrated with their mother from New York through the Isthmus of Panama, had graduated from the University of the Pacific in 1877, right? So here is our firstborn child. Samuel had immigrated from Ireland. Their first child graduates from the University of the Pacific in 1877. Una, she passes her Teachers County Board exam in 1880. She goes on and attends California State Normal School, San Jose State University. I haven't quite verified that she graduated with a degree from there, but it appears she was very close to graduating from that. California State Normal School, San Jose, trained school teachers. Okay, then we have Olive, his mom, right? So Olive Hamilton, at 18, had passed the county board exam December 4th, 1844, with a percentage score of 82, was granted a Monterey County teacher certificate. So she's got a teacher's certificate in 1884 as well. Here's a picture of Olive Hamilton graduating from the high school, Salinas High School, 1883, one of 13 girls to graduate. So she's got high school education, right? Nothing to sneeze at in 1883. So you gotta be asking yourself, Don, how do you get to these little mundane points like score of 82, right? Well, what you gotta do is go over to the Monterey County Office of Education, because I had asked Mary Gamble, Mary, where do I find out where Una and Olive had taught in Monterey County? Where were these schools? It says in East Eden that she was down at Peachtree. She's down at Plato, South Monterey County. Steinbeck says she's down in Big Sur, right? I'm like, was she really down in Big Sur? You know, Steinbeck kind of, put it together the best he could. So you send an email and you get permission to go to the Monterey County Office of Education, right? And you walk in there and they give you these great big ledgers. And you just start going through them and you're back there and you're taking pictures, snapping pictures. And the admin are looking over at you like, what's he doing? What's he doing? Oh, he's just doing some research on, teachers in Monterey County. I'm going through and I'm finding out where actually Una and Olive taught in Monterey County. And here's, they're both associated with the Monterey County Teachers Institute. This is the annual convention from Colton Hall, 1889. Where all the school teachers in Monterey County would get together for the year at their annual convention, predominantly women. Charles Herman Allen is at the center of that picture, directly below the bell. The photograph I noticed over at Colton Hall one day, so I asked if I could use it for this presentation. Somewhere in that picture is more than likely Olive Hamilton. All right, so what schools look like in Monterey County that Mrs. Steinbeck and Una Hamilton taught at? They are little or nothing. Board and batten, shacks. We always think about, oh, no, that must be glamorous little beautiful schoolhouse. So I started looking for what it really looked like. And Steinbeck pretty much lays this out in East of Eden, how hard it was to be a school teacher in Monterey County. Because it was very rural, very isolated, and it's 1880 to 1890. The train's not going through the valley. Well, I think it goes 1876 to Soledad. Here's Corral de Tierra, Carmel Valley, 1890. Here's your mode of transportation. The La Gloria Schoolhouse, House Gonzales, 1887. Here's the last school that Olive taught at, final term as a school teacher during the school of 1889, 1890, when she taught the schoolhouse in King City. So it's her last term, right? 1889, 1890, she gets married to Mr. Steinbeck. They move into Salinas. When he was transferred to the Sperry Mill Flour Company, Steinbeck's born in 1902. So Mrs. Steinbeck's now living in Salinas. Was a school teacher. But they also get in 1903, John and Olive purchased not one but 2 lots in Pacific Grove on 11th Street. Upon one lot, the family built a small 3-bedroom summer cottage, and the other lot was planted the garden. It's Pacific Grove. It's the summertime. What's still going on in Pacific Grove in the summertime? The Chautauqua program. So more than likely, she's participating in the Chautauqua program. And a lot of women's clubs, women's movements are taking place also associated with that Chautauqua program and located in Pacific Grove. Maya mentioned that women's clubs were very big back then in every small community. Like they had a Chautauqua circle where you could gather together and learn your education. Those evolved into women's clubs, right? So this is the progressive period in America. This is the progressive era, which was widespread social activism, political reform across the United States, spanned from 1890s to 1920s. Having established a Protestant foothold in California, and you see this stretched up and down the coastline with the establishment of churches up and down the coast. There's the oldest Methodist church that sits in Half Moon Bay. There's a Protestant church that sits in Soquel, dates back to 1867. Pacific Grove's full of Protestant churches. So they established their foothold along the shoreline of California. The idea was to get these churches established on the West Coast, so San Francisco itself would look like a city on the hill, much as they had thought Boston would, or the New England colonies would on the East Coast, right? These progressive institutions remain loyal to the Christian values of the New England Protestants, further shaped the civil and civic ethics of California's Central Coast. So you see the California Christian Temperance Union, no drinking of alcohol, big movement in California. Still in Watsonville, there's a drinking fountain that was established for by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, so you wouldn't turn to alcohol to drink. You could go get a drink of water from the water fountain. The American Red Cross was established, Salvation Army, the YMCA, the YWCA, all involved with this progressive movement and civic organizations and temperance unions. So Steinbeck actually, in his writings, he addresses a lot of this in such a manner that he presents the social ills in a manner that evokes from his readers compassion for those living on the fringes of society. The same type of people the civic organizations are trying to help. The bordellos of Salinas that appear in East of Eden, the mixed-blood, promiscuous, drunken paisanos of Still Flats, and the gamblers, bums, winos, and prostitutes, Cameron Row, help to raise American consciousness to consider the downtrodden, the misfits, shall we say. Women's clubs. Women's clubs are really big at this time. They have their own magazines every month put out. The Women's Citizens Club, San Francisco. Every Woman, San Francisco Journal. Might have been located nationally. So then I start thinking about Mrs. Steinbeck in Salinas, and I've always heard that she's a member of this Wanderers Club, right? Where they get around, women would gather at individual houses who were members, and they would talk about travel books. But if that's true, the first civic club in Salinas was the Salinas Civic Club. That's the first women's club that was established in 1900. Actually, the Wanderers Club established, in 1905, followed by the Salinas Civic Club in 1906. And then, by searching the web like I do, searching the internet, I find a list of the women who are the members of this club. And I'm like, well, who are these women in Salinas, right? Who are members of this club? Turns out a good number of these women are very well educated. Graduates of University of California, Berkeley, graduates of Stanford University, and they're school teachers. They're school teachers in Salinas, right? So they're Steinbeck school teachers, very well educated. His graduating class for her senior year was 26 students. He's got very well educated school teachers. Ora Cupp and Emma Hawkins, two of Salinas high school teachers, were recognized as Steinbeck's exceptional writing abilities. Look at the high school that Steinbeck would attend, built in 1905. Nice community, nice school teachers. Why couldn't he graduate from Stanford University? He is extremely well educated. Okay, the Salinas Public Library, Salinas, California, in 1909, Mrs. Carrie Stryling. She's the first librarian for the Salinas Public Library. She's a member of both the Civic Club and the Wanderers Clubs, but she's also very good friends with Alice Steinbeck, right? Alice Steinbeck, at the time, served as the maid of honor in the wedding of Carrie Miller to John Stryling. So they've got a close connection. And Steinbeck talks about spending lots of time down at that library. What do the Wanderers Study Club do? What do they study? Travel? Yes, they travel. Well, they look at different countries every year. So they pick a country to study on a basis. First came the study of Italy, then the study of Germany, followed by a year studying Denmark, Scandinavia. The next few years were directed to France, followed by the study of Great Britain. These years were marked by Mrs. Wheeler as president of the Wanderers. They're studying the Northern European countries. Anybody notice that? They're not looking at Southern European, not looking at India, Japan, or Mexico, or any place like that. Well, when Mrs. Steinbeck comes along, I want to mention Ann Hayden. When she first comes to Monterey County in 1914, she becomes a member of the Wanderers Club as well. Well, when Mrs. Steinbeck becomes becomes president of the Wanderers Club, after Mrs. Wheeler, she wants to study first Ireland, where her homeland from. Second one that she wants to study, the second year, she wants to study a study of Russia and Southern Europe, presenting the problems of their immigrants to the Pacific coast. From the May 1914 program, we have the problem of distribution of immigrants. Is immigration sufficiently restricted? Ain't this sound familiar? But also, what's Steinbeck talking about? Immigration, right? From the Dust Bowl into California. Who's this land for? He addresses this in Grapes of Wrath. And then so we also look at what's happened to us in Salinas Valley during this period of time is first workers in Salinas Valley to come work the fields, actually into the fields, is the Chinese, followed by the Japanese, followed by the Filipinos, and the Latinos. You see them researching and studying each of these countries during that period of time. Then there's the exclusion that takes place for each of these individual immigrants that come to work these, right? Chinese Exclusion Act, the Immigration Act of 1877, the Webb Alien Land Law Act of 1913, and the Immigration Act of 1924. Steinbeck pretty much watches all these take place during his period. Mrs. Steinbeck, right? 1911, in California, there's the movement for the women to get the right to vote. They win the right to vote in 1911. in the 19th Amendment of the US Constitution granted the right to vote in 1920, right? So where's Mrs. Steinbeck stand in the right to vote? Is she a registered voter? Well, once again, you do enough research, you'll find something in the newspaper, and here in the fall of 1920, one finds Alice Steinbeck serving as secretary of Monterey County's Republican Central Committee. In November of 1920, Mrs. Steinbeck provided the following comment, right? Mrs. Alice Steinbeck, secretary of the Secretary's County Central Community, says, the women of Monterey County are taking active and intelligent interest of politics this year. They approach the political question with open minds and have been doing considerable thinking. I am certain that the majority of the women in this country are for Harding and Coolidge on the national issues and for Shortridge and Free for the state and national issues. So you can only wonder how many members of the Women's Club in the Wanderers Club and the Salinas Civic Club were also registered voters. One other thing, in 1923, 1924, as they're studying Japan, this shows you how progressive and how civic Mrs. Steinbeck was she had a motion during the meeting at Mrs. Lacey's house to order that a letter be sent to Senator Shortridge asking his consideration for a child labor amendment. So what we see is, and get a better understanding of Mrs. Steinbeck, the Wanderers Study Club, and the progressive movement, the progressive women of California during that period of time. And with that is the end.